So a little bit about Batya. She received both her undergraduate and graduate degrees at some other UC up north in the Bay Area. I don't know, it's probably unheard of. And she's now a professor at the University of Washington. She co-directs the Value Sensitive Design Research Lab and the Tech Policy Lab. And Batya is, at least to me, and I think to many people, most known for sort of pioneering this work in value-sensitive design, taking into account values throughout the design process. She's received the ACM SIG Chi Social Impact Award, and I always try to find some things that maybe the speaker doesn't know I know about them. So I have a few of those. She took an improv comedy course to help her prepare for research communication. She's an avid tea drinker. She's an avid hiker. She's known to spend large periods of time off the grid in the high Sierras. She's also a stone sculptor, and I bet this is one of her stone works. And she has a place in eastern Washington, and one of the things she does there is to sculpt large pieces of stone. And the web tells you everything. So I searched around a little bit. I found an article about her, and I'll quote a little bit from it. Stone carver, university professor, and part-time Valley resident, Batya Friedman, slowly chips away at an ancient limestone pillar at her open-air studio in Twist Works South Shed, part of a sculpture quartet titled Passages, which I would bet that's one of them.
It is.
The stone stands like a slender human figure, around 5 feet high, with flat plane, sensuous curves, and a pale ivory color. Friedman quickly taps the surface of the soft stone with a hammer, paying close attention to the changing interplay of light and shadow, leaving at its base a drift of white dust. And then a quote from the sculptor herself: "I love everything about stone. How it smells, what it feels like when you touch it, how it can bend light, the slow, gentle way of carving with the brushing hammer, all of the surprises in the stone that become part of the piece. I have a sense that what I've learned about engaging complexity from carving, working in 3 dimensions, is carried over to how I approach designing information systems in complex socio-political contexts." She also mentioned, "It's been a personal goal to carve something bigger than myself." I think the research she has is really also bears testament. It's really brought a lot of people looking at some very important issues. And I was trying to think when I first met Batya, and we were talking about this a little bit before, and I think it was at a NSF panel where we're sort of reviewing proposals. And I remember just really vividly, not the panel at all or what we were doing, but going to lunch with Batya, and she was telling me about a project, Voices from the Rwanda Tribunal, that she was involved in. And the project there, she was attempting to document the sort of awful genocide that happened in Rwanda in 1994. And with the goal of helping everyone, and I think especially the people most impacted by that, to be able to grapple with the kind of horrific event. And the project, from my mind, is one of the first kind of design projects that really began to look multi-lifespan wise. I mean, most of the kind of design that too many people do don't look beyond the click, but to think about what you're doing and how it affects multiple lifespan. I can't say that. So Batya thinks really long-term and about important issues. And today she's going to talk about more on technical imagination and value-sensitive design perspective. I love this.
Well, thank you, Jim. I believe that is the loveliest introduction I have ever had. So this is really. I'm delighted to be here with you all today and talk a bit about our own moral and technical imaginations, and show you how I've been thinking about that from a value-sensitive design perspective. One thing that you'll notice is On your seats, everybody should have a card. Does everyone have one of these little cards? Okay, that's good. One of the other things that you're going to need is a partner. So I'm going to suggest that, can everybody just kind of move forward and fill in all the seats, because we're going to need to be next to each other. So just kind of fill your way in, make sure you're sitting next to someone. Those of you in the back, come on forward too. Mm-hmm. Okay, there should be a card on every seat. All right. Some of you guys from the back, you're going to need to move a little bit. Okay, then what I'd like you to do, once you've settled in, is turn to the person next to you and introduce yourself, because you're going to be working with this person for a little bit. Okay, great. All right, that's enough of a conversation. All right, so don't worry, you're gonna have a chance to talk with your partner or partners again. So good that you know them. And as Jim mentioned, I'm Batya Friedman from the University of Washington, from the Information School. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to start out by talking about our moral imaginations and technical imaginations. And to give you an idea of what I mean, I'd like to read to you a short quote from Rabindranath Tagore. I'm probably not pronouncing his first name correctly. But he writes, the water vessel, taken as a vessel only, raises the question, why does it exist at all? Through its fitness of construction, it offers the apology for its existence. But where it is a work of beauty, it has no question to answer. It has nothing to do but to be. And I think in this very simple quote, what Tagore is telling us is that everyone is entitled to water, clean, pure water, that you need a vessel to hold it, and that vessel should be beautiful. And we think about what that means we all have basic needs of a certain sort, that those needs should be fulfilled, and that we also go beyond those basic needs to flourish as human beings in really rich and beautiful ways. And we need to build our societies in ways that we can meet our needs, and so that they can be beautiful in the way in which we do that, so that we can flourish. And those are the things that I'd like to talk about today in terms of invoking our moral imaginations for how we can create beauty in those needs, and how we can use our technical imaginations to help us do so. So I'm going to be talking about human values, and the definition that I'm going to use for human values is what is important to people in their lives. And as we talk about that, I'm going to focus on ethics and morality. So the starting point for my thinking is that part of being human is tool use. The tool use is a fundamental part of the human condition. And as Jim was alluding to, our tools shape how we interact with and experience the world, how we experience each other, and in turn, those lead to new tools. And so there's this fundamental interactional relationship between the things that we build, and then once we build them, we live within them. So as Terry Winograd and Fernando Flores wrote in 1986, in designing tools, we're designing ways of being. So this is one of my favorite tools. You may have one of these as well. This is really great when, I need to turn a screw. It's also very useful to me in the late fall when I'm planting my bulbs for the year, because then I can go out in my garden, I can dig these holes and I can stick my bulbs in. But it's not so good if I need to ladle soup. And so there's this way in which all of the technologies that we build are really well designed for certain sorts of things. In fact, we can think about how it is that they shape our interaction, and that in turn shapes our human experience. So they enable what's easy to do, they hinder or make certain kinds of things hard to do, but they're doable. And sometimes they actually prevent or make certain sorts of things truly impossible. So if I want to communicate with someone and I have absolutely no channel through which to reach them, then we can make it impossible for that communication to happen. So design matters. There's a lot at stake in how we build these tools and what kinds of things we're going to make it easy for human beings to do, what kinds of things are we going to make it hard for them to do, and what kinds of things will be impossible. It's also the case, though, that design doesn't control everything. So, for example, as designers, I can build a building so that people in a wheelchair can access the building. But as the designer of the building, I don't control that the employers who are in that building will hire people who work in wheelchairs, right? So as designers, we have to recognize what aspects of the problems that we're engaging we have some kind of control or say over, and where it is that there are others who are controlling other pieces. And our work is always done in a dialogue in these kinds of parameters. So value-sensitive design is an interactional theory and method that accounts for human values in a principled and structured manner throughout the design process. And so what we have been trying to do in developing value-sensitive design in a very practical and pragmatic way is try to understand how can we foreground human values in the technical design process so that as we do our technical work, we are engaging explicitly with human values and with those who are affected by the tools and technologies that we'll build, such that we hope they're more likely to support the values that people care about, that those who are affected care about and feel are important to them. So what sorts of values? Well, a whole range of values. These are some. There are many others that could be added here. And perhaps the more important thing are not the particular values that I've called out, but the fact that you see them displayed on a web. I mean, the way that we experience values in human life is, if I pick up one value, I get a whole bunch of other values with it. If I pick up privacy, then I probably pick up security and trust and some other kinds of things. If I pick up community, I pick up awareness. There's probably also privacy and autonomy and agency that's also connected in there. So these values sit in a delicate balance with each other. And in doing our work, we have made a strategic decision not to focus on a single value and not to focus on a single technology, because the goal is to build a more general theory and practice around how to foreground human values in the technical design process, such that whatever technology or tool we bring to the fore, we have the tools and the machinery to engage with human values with that technology. So these are just some examples of the technologies that I've worked with over the last couple of decades, ranging from Sony's Aibo human-robotic interaction back when that little robotic dog was on the market, to some of the very, very early location-aware systems. This is a system that came out of Intel. It was one of the first location-aware systems that was available. Looking at implantable medical devices, very personal kinds of devices. Groupware systems in large software organizations, telepresence, large-scale urban simulations, large displays, and looking at different ways to bring the outside or nature into other kinds of environments. And this is just a sampling of the technologies that we've worked with. So we made a very explicit strategic decision in order to avoid blind spots in developing this set of practices and these theoretical constructs to then work across a range of values and a range of technologies. So one of the things that comes out of taking seriously the interactional stance about values and technology, the fact that as human beings with our values we build tools and then those tools shape our experience, when you start to dig into that, you recognize that you can't get at those actual issues or problems in the design process unless you engage multiple kinds of investigations. So one kind of investigation is conceptual. You know, what can I do when I'm sitting here in my office armchairing a situation? So I can think potentially about the stakeholders who might be involved. And we talk about direct stakeholders. If you think about user-centered design or users, those are the people who are touching the technology. Those are often the direct stakeholders. But we also think about indirect stakeholders. We think about people who are affected by a technology even though they're never going to touch it. You guys, how many people here have cell phones? All right. How many people are sitting next to someone with a cell phone? Okay, when you're sitting next to someone with a cell phone, you're an indirect stakeholder with respect to their technology, right? So a same person can assume both roles. These are about roles. You can be a direct stakeholder and an indirect stakeholder with respect to the same technology. But also when we talk about human values, we need to know what it is that we're talking about. So in a lot of work, for example, you'll hear people talk about privacy or you'll hear people talk about security. Well, what do they really mean by privacy? By privacy in a particular situation, are they talking about the ability to withdraw from society, to be left alone? Are they talking about the ability to control the flow of their information? Those are very different ideas and definitions about privacy, and they have implications for the design process, right? If we're speaking about the problem of attention, right, then by privacy and the ability to withdraw from society, what I'm saying is, I want the ability to control my own attention. You can't come at me, then you're invading my privacy. That's not about controlling my information flow. That's a notion of privacy that helps me think about this problem of attention. So all of those are part of what we can do in terms of a conceptual investigation, but conceptual investigations can only go so far. We're really talking about people and their experience of these technologies. And so, you know, we can try to empathize and take their views and perspectives, but at a certain point, we need to engage with the people who are the stakeholders, in various kinds of stakeholders. And when we do that kind of empirical work, we can use all the very best tools that we have from the social sciences. And depending on what you're trying to learn, if you're trying to elicit their visions for a future, if you're trying to understand how they resolve certain kinds of value tensions, you might use different kinds of methods, and we'll dive into that in a little bit. And then we're fundamentally in this work thinking about our tools, our tool use, our tool building, and by tool I mean simple tools, technology, and also infrastructure. So there are going to need to be technical investigations as well. It might be that I go back and look at existing technologies to try to understand how they are embedding certain sorts of values or how people are experiencing them. But often our work is proactive. We're looking towards the building of new technologies and thinking about how we can foreground human values so that in our technical design processes, our technologies are more responsive to those values. The point is that to do this work well, you have to engage in all three types of investigations. And not only that, you don't just do it once. That really, to do this work well, it needs to be integrative and it needs to be iterative. So what I learned from working with people, they may surface different values than what I thought about when I did my conceptual investigation. So the set of relevant values may shift. And then I may use that to build some features into a certain technical system, which I then need to take back to the people. And when I take it back to my stakeholders, lo and behold, they may push back on that technical design and ask for other kinds of technical resolutions, right? So you can sort of feel how this is a series of investigations that you're continually oscillating among as the design process unfolds, you know, over a period of time. And then another thing I want to point out is that, you know, as human beings, we don't live in this sort of like very harmonious value landscape. Somehow human life, social life, is full of tension, right? So just think for a minute about yourself, your personal self. Have you ever felt conflicted? Where you held two strongly held values, and in a given situation they would have you act in different ways, and you just feel that internal tension. So value tensions can exist within a single individual. We probably also all experience situations where we have a really good friend and all of a sudden we find that we have a conflict, a value conflict between two people, or maybe a conflict that you have between yourself and a group, or with institutions, or with governments. So value tensions pervade all the levels of social existence. And they're the stuff that we get to work with. So when we're engaged in the design process, often what we're doing are focusing in on where the value tensions are and then trying to look for better ways to work with those value tensions. So I just want to talk about how value tensions have been talked about in the literature over the last 15 or 20 years to give you a flavor for how language can reflect design process and a style of working. Fairly early on, I think the phrase that people used was the talk of design trade-offs. And actually that is still a term that you see a great deal. When you talk about a design trade-off, the approach conveys this sense that you're going to have to design for one value at the expense of the other. So designing for one value is somehow going to diminish the other. So if you consider these values of privacy and security, if you take a design trade-off orientation, then that casts the design situation as one in which either privacy, say that one is left alone, is well supported at the expense of security, where one is watched to ensure protection, or vice versa. So it gives you this idea, well, I can't have both. I have to pick one or the other. So it's kind of like, black and white glasses. The glasses are black or the glasses are white, but I have to see the world in one way or the other. Another kind of language is value conflict. And value conflict, in contrast, acknowledges potential opposition among values, but leaves open whether or not their resolution must diminish one in order to support the others. So it's a slightly gentler approach. So if we again think about privacy and security goals coming into conflict, can we seek design resolutions that are responsive to both? So for example, let's say that you have an isolated local area network without any wireless connectivity. So an office, everybody's connected to each other, but they're not connected to the internet. That is an environment that can give privacy vis-a-vis the rest of the world and security, right? So we can have our cake and eat it too in that situation, right? So that's not to say that technical solutions such as this that support both values will always be possible. The isolated local area network, for example, might have practical implications for a third value, that of access or connectivity. But my point is that a value conflict framing orients the designer to seek solutions that do not necessarily optimize one value at the expense of the other. So this is really about what your orientation as a designer is to your situation. And then finally, I want to talk about value tensions, which is the language that I'm using now and that I personally find the most productive. So like that of value conflict, it conveys the idea of values potentially in opposition, but it allows for solutions that balance each value in relation to the others, such that the adjudication of the tension holds each value intact. So for example, a system that judiciously allows some types of information in some contexts to be anonymous, supporting privacy, while requiring other types of information in other contexts to have known sources, supporting security through accountability. So that might be one way to realize a balance. So what kind of language you use for yourself as a designer to think about an approach, these things called value tensions orients you to look for different kinds of solutions and pathways for solution. Okay, so around about now, I thought it might be nice to try out some of these ideas. So we're going to do a bit of a design activity. So the activity that we're going to do is about this piece of technology that's called SafetyNet. So SafetyNet is a hypothetical commercial software platform which leverages publicly available demographic and criminal data, mapping technology, and satellite tracking capabilities. You can throw in some machine learning in there to create maps for display on various mobile technologies like cell phones, in-car navigation systems. These maps are used to alert urban travelers as they venture into potentially unpleasant or dangerous areas during their travels. Okay, everybody got that? You're walking around with your cell phone, you have a map, and as you're walking around or driving around, all of a sudden there are these big blotchy red areas on your cell phone that tell you that, well, there might be some dangerous criminal activity around here, right? That's the technology we're talking about. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is introduce you to one of the tools that we've developed. It's a toolkit called the Envisioning Cards. I have one here, and you each have one on your seats. So you'll notice that this card, on one side it has hopefully what you find to be a provocative image and a title. The one here says Perceptions of a Value. The one in my hand says Sustained Friendship. And then if you flip that card over, you'll see across the top there are 4 categories: stakeholders, time, values, or pervasiveness. So 4 different kinds of lenses to bring to the design process. Stakeholders, are we thinking about who is impacted? Time, are we thinking about longer term implications of the design? Values, what values might be implicated? And pervasiveness, how widespread is this particular application and what is happening? Also on this card, you'll see the title, and then you'll see the theme over here and a very specific design action that you can take. All right? So what I'd like you to do is turn to your partner. You each have a card. It should be a different card. And what I have here that comes with our kit is a little 3-minute timer. Okay? So I'm going to flip the timer over. And when I do, I want one of you to use your card and in conversation with your partner, use your card to help you consider the value implications of the SafetyNet application. Okay? Any questions before we get started? And then, of course, we'll do 3 minutes for the other partner. Okay. So please, go ahead. Okay, so our timer has run out. So what I'm going to do now is ask everyone to finish your last sentence. And then we're going to shift. So the other partner who has a different card is going to now bring their card into the conversation. So you're going to look again at this scenario, but from the perspective of the second card. So I'm going to flip the timer over and go. Okay, I'm going to ask everybody to finish your last sentence. Great, thank you. So maybe we can hear from 1 or 2 people. Something interesting that came up in your conversation. Maybe you can tell us what card you had, and then an interesting observation, something that arose that you found intriguing. Anybody? Yes, please. And your name?
My name is Wayne, and we discovered that people who are blind may not be able to use this technology as well, and they're probably the most challenged community because so much of our digital technologies these days require an interface, and so I guess one workaround would be to provide more haptic feedback, so maybe utilizing like Braille keyboards or some sort of operating system that the ASL community can use could
Great. And could you tell us what card you had, by the way?
Well, I mean, I had values, but we discussed this more over stakeholders for variations under our human ability.
Variations on human ability card. Okay, great. Is there some other group that had a different card, but also an interesting something that came up? Yes, and you are?
Nancy, my partner had the card for time, and it was sustained friendships, the one that he used as an example. And she brought up a point that I personally relate to, because when I was younger, my parents were like really protective of me. And she's like, oh, one of the family relationships that may change is that parents can be more relaxed when they let their kids go out with the use of this app.
Great, thank you. And one last one, yes, Lily?
Well, this is just tacking on to this. I was actually imagining if my parents had this, I was imagining that they would use it to kind of police where I go more, because now they can say, oh, well, you say you're going to this place. Like, we see that there's criminal information. My parents aren't that great at tracking this stuff down on government websites where it does exist. It's interesting that we have parent as the question, but different ideas about it.
Okay, and what card did you have that's
Oh, we also have
sustained friendship? Okay, great, thank you. So now what I'd like to do is introduce you to another method that we could apply to the same situation, right? And the method I want to introduce you to now is called value scenarios. So how many people here are familiar with scenario-based design? Is that familiar to most people? Not to most people. So it's a very common, well-known, well-used kind of method in the human-computer interaction community. And the way traditional scenario-based design works is that you're usually focused on a single user in a particular context and largely focused on the functionality of what's going on with that one user in that one moment in time. So let me read to you what a traditional scenario might be like for this safety net example that we were talking about. So it's 2017, and Jack is beyond, oh, wait, I'm reading the wrong one. It's 2017 though still. Sarah and her daughter Lyrel recently moved to the city. Sarah found a full-time job with decent pay in an apartment which accepts cats. The one worry she had left concerned 12-year-old Lyrel walking home from school alone. After hearing about SafetyNet on TV, Sarah purchased a subscription for Lyrel's cell phone. Sarah used SafetyNet to map out the safest route to and from Lyrel's school. Now the cell phone will emit a warning tone if Lyrel gets too close to a neighborhood designated as questionable or dangerous. Sounds a lot like Lily's parents. All right, so that's a traditional scenario. It has you think about this one family, Sarah and her daughter Lyrel, the functionality of the application in their very particular use and how it will work. A value scenario asks you to think more systematically about the values that are involved, a whole range of stakeholders, both direct and indirect. What happens if the particular application is taken up pervasively, right? And over a longer period of time. So let me read to you what a value scenario for this same application would be. So Kanbaro lives in a safety net world, yet has never actually used the device. Her mother says SafetyNet keeps strangers out of the neighborhood. Yet Kanbaro has overheard her father complaining that since SafetyNet labels their neighborhood as poor in Somali, only poor Somalis move in. Neighbors joke that if a new car comes down the street, its SafetyNet must be busted. Kanbaro's little brother is convinced that SafetyNet is a real net which encircles their neighborhood. Kanbaro wonders whom the net is supposed to catch. The 2004th Street Gang has figured out the answer to Kanbaro's question. They regularly use SafetyNet to locate the home of the catch du jour. For years, home buyers have been using SafetyNet to find decent neighborhoods filled with people like themselves. As a result, the city has become segregated into homogeneous enclaves. Thus, whether they are seeking to revenge themselves on a Chinese person or someone of Mexican descent, the demographic information is just a few clicks away. SafetyNet is the ultimate profiling tool. So you can see the idea of a scenario and how that changes when you foreground human values and you start to think of the pervasive uptake of a technology over time. And you also start to consider both direct and indirect stakeholders, and also what might be some unanticipated or nefarious use of a particular technology. So what I want to point out is that in a brief 15 minutes, all of you engaged in value-sensitive design. All of you were able, in a very short period of time, to be shown a scenario or a technology that you hadn't seen before, and to very productively and in very interesting ways surface a number of value tensions, potential harms, potential benefits that might come from that technology, and also to participate in envisioning what it might be like if we took up that technology over time. So you could ask about this little, 3-minute hourglass. Is this a gimmick or is this really useful? I've asked that question. In a certain way, it kind of seems like a gimmick. The reason it doesn't seem like a gimmick is that often when you are working with engineers, and any of us, we can feel overwhelmed when we think about human values. And when somebody says, well, ethics and morals, it's kind of, you so much don't know what to do that you can experience a kind of paralysis. But if you go to an engineering team or a product development team and you say, give me 3 minutes on the hourglass with one of these cards, or let's indulge 15 minutes, we'll pick 5 cards. And then you surface a huge amount that can be valuable to you in the design process, and you keep those cards with you persistent. So they stay with you throughout the design process. You can use them for ideation in early phases in the design. You can use them at different checkpoints to check in and to judge the quality of the design that you're doing. People can use them to bring to the table to challenge aspects of the design. They can become your evaluation criteria at the end of the design process. And the investment of time can be quite small. It can be quite small because in a certain way we're not asking ourselves to get the design right, and we're not asking ourselves to be comprehensive because that could be paralyzing. We're asking ourselves to do a better job, to make progress. And that you'll see that that's a really important mantra to have if we're going to try to really engage with values in the technical design process. Because we just simply can't get it right. So we have to let go of that question and find other ways to work. So I want to point out that in doing our work that we have over the years, and this is not a short period of time, but a couple of decades, worked intentionally across many layers and levels of society, from things very individual and very personal, like an implantable medical device, a pacemaker. What could be more personal than that? Small group interactions, kids with robotic pets, organizations looking at groupware systems in large software companies, to public spaces, looking at public records online, looking at large-scale urban simulation, to working on systems for international justice, both in Rwanda following the 1994 genocide there, and most recently with the International Criminal Court. So the kinds of methods, the theory that we're working with, the theoretical constructs, and these tools of the envisioning cards, of value scenarios, and the other methods we've developed, we can use at all of these different levels to good effect. So I'd like to mention quite briefly one current project, very briefly, and then I'd like to leave you with some very big ideas. This particular project I'm doing with Emily Bender, and we've been worried about the kinds of biases that are implicit in a lot of the machine learning and natural language processing systems that are being deployed. And we, of course, are not the only ones who are worried about this. It's a hot topic of conversation. But what we have been doing is applying a value-sensitive design process to that, and asking how can we improve the situation. One of the things that's happened now, probably one of the most common problems, is that when you build one of these systems, you train it and test it on some data set. And then you deploy the system. And where you deploy the system may or may not match with the populations on which you've trained the data set. So, very clear example, I'm building a system here at UC San Diego that's going to be a 911 system, audio. You call 911, the person's going to talk to this automated system. And I'm training it on the data from people who live in La Jolla. And then we're going to go deploy this in New York City and Harlem, right? People who are going to be calling up are not going to speak the same way that people are going to speak here in La Jolla, and that system is going to fail. And people aren't going to get 911 services when they really need it. So the harms there are significant. So what we're doing here is we're proposing that anytime a natural language system is built, that part of its documentation, its standard documentation, is something that we call a data statement. And the data statement lays out, and we have provided a very detailed schema, but the language variety, what language is being spoken. Is this English as spoken in San Diego or English as spoken in Harlem? Speaker demographic, who are the speakers? Is English their first language? Is English their second language or third or fourth language? Annotator demographic. Oftentimes the codings that are being used are being done by a third party. So that third party brings their whole worldview to the data and the categories that they ascribe. The speech situation. People change their speech depending upon whom they're talking to. So you need to know the speech situation if you're going to analyze the content of the speech. The text characteristics, what the recording was, curation rationale. Curation rationale, what did you select to include? The person who makes those selections has huge impacts on what's actually represented in the collection. And then we also want to pay attention to provenance, how things change or are repurposed over time. Our proposal is that every natural language processing system should have this documentation with it when it's built, and that documentation should travel with that system so that if it's tested on other kinds of data sets, that becomes a part of the record as well. And then the idea is that we won't have quite such terrible mismatch problems, because if I'm going to deploy it in a certain location, I'll actually be able to scrutinize what kind of training and testing data set was used so I can avoid that particular problem. But an even larger problem for the natural language processing community is knowing what their data catalog is. That is, what are the language sets that comprise all of the data sets out there that people are testing from? And more importantly, what's not represented at all in any data set. And that turns out, the intuitions of people is that it's quite significant. And so if the field as a whole can do this, then the field as a whole can collectively act to identify existing data sets and then what groups, what speakers, what stakeholders are not represented in any data set, and then actually systematically as a collective begin to fill that in. The same way in which mathematicians, when they were working on group theory, sort of divvied out all the problems and then made sure that they as a collective filled in that space. We also looked at some negative things that could happen, and I want to tell you that the tool we used to do this were value scenarios. So value scenarios worked for us as a tool to be able to fill out and examine what this kind of proposal would look like. Okay, so I give that to you just to show you that we can use these tools in solving real problems. And then I want to spend a minute talking about 4 futures, and I'll do that kind of quickly because I can see that people are needing to slip out. But I want to up the ante here for you. We've been talking about specific problems, and what I want to talk about right now are what are the really, in certain ways, big picture challenges that we need to be thinking about for our society and for our globe. So the first image here, you can see that these are sort of birds flying together. I want to use this to represent the idea of some kind of collective intelligence. People have talked about collective intelligence. But I believe that there are ways in which we're really poised now to think and solve problems in ways that don't exist within a single human mind, but are spread across multiple minds. And that we may really be seeing something quite novel happening. And we should be alert to that kind of self-organizing, self-regulating systems that are going on. I'm going to talk about these in an abbreviated fashion. But I think related to that is something that has to do with brains. You know, in the same way in which we may think about problems being distributed across people, if we think about what's happening with a lot of, well, to ourselves, but also to a lot of younger people, they are not experiencing a lot of uninterrupted time, right? Many, many young children, you know, we're talking even 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, they're either interacting with cell phones or they're watching things on TV where the images change really quickly. They're leading disrupted interactions, right? So one of the things that's interesting is their brains, I would speculate, are being developed in a way so they're very facile at processing very small bits of information. They're probably not being developed in a way so that they're very facile at processing longer bits of information. My hypothesis is that the people who are 3, 4, and 5 now, in about 15 years, are going to be thinking and solving problems in radically different ways than you all or people who are 10 years, 15 years older than most of you sitting in the room. And that will be because the fundamental structure of their brains are different. So we don't know if that will be a good thing or a bad thing. What I want to point out is that societally we're doing a huge experiment on the next generation, and we're not thinking about it, we're not talking about it. We didn't make an intentional decision that we thought this would be a good way to go. And we're trusting the rest of the next generations. It's not just their generation, it's the generation after them and after them and after them, to a society of people who will think very well about short bits of information. Maybe their brains will be particularly well suited to some kind of collective or distributed intelligence, much better than ours. We don't know. Those are big open questions. My point is that as technologists, scientists, and engineers, we're creating the infrastructure for all of this to happen, but we're not helping the public ask these questions. We're not engaging the public in those conversations, right? The next picture I want to point you to is the cloud. Before I talk about the cloud, I want to go back to when I was a university student, and what we were talking about then was nuclear power. And what I asked my friends who were nuclear engineers is, who wanted to build these nuclear power plants, I said, well, what about the waste? And at the time, what they said was, well, don't worry about it. By the time we've generated the waste in 10 years, we'll know what to do with it. And I kind of looked at them and I thought, well, that's not what I learned about worst case planning and engineering. What if you can't solve it? But society went forward. We built those nuclear power plants. We tied our energy infrastructure to it. We generated all that waste. And now here it is. I'm long past being an undergraduate. And we have a huge amount of nuclear waste, and we don't know what to do with it. Okay, cloud. I don't know about you, but I sure feel forced to put all of my data into the cloud, which actually isn't a cloud, it's a bunch of servers sitting somewhere. Two things about that cloud. So right now, virtually everything that we're collecting, all of the data, and I mean both your personal and private records, the things that you really care about preserving for your family, as well as your health records, your school records, your financial records, they're all sitting on media that lasts maybe 5 years, maybe 10, we don't actually know. But all of those servers and all of those bits decay in very short periods of time. Paper is far more stable. Film is far more stable. We've put an entire infrastructure in a place that's going to deteriorate on a very short time frame. What is the sanity of that? The other thing I want to say about the cloud is that we put all of this really important information there, but we don't know how to keep it secure. this is like the nuclear power plant. This is like listening to people tell us we'll solve that. In 5 years and 10 years, I'll solve the security problem. I'll solve the stability of the medium problem. In the meantime, we're asking everyone in the society to trust in that and to build all of this infrastructure and put all of our data there. It's a very non-resilient system, right? So going back to just basic engineering practices about building in resilience, building in worst case planning and accounting for those things, what is the nature of responsible innovation? And what is our role as designers and technologists in that process when we know these things? And then the last has to do with the planet. I mean, the planet is a limited, finite resource. We hear proposals about IoT, Internet of Things. The latest proposal I heard was that every person, maybe in the developed world, but will have 200 of these devices on their bodies. Well, 200 of those devices times the number of people, times the population growing. I mean, you can do the math. That's a big number, right? That's a really big number. We're pulling all of those metals out of the earth. We're assembling all of these things. We're building in obsolescence so that they are going to deteriorate in some piece very shortly, so we need to keep replenishing them. How does that match with the scale of material on the planet? It's a simple question. We're building all kinds of algorithms. I mean, Bitcoin is a great example, but all of the algorithms that we're building take huge and increasingly huge amounts of computation. Computation requires machines that you compute on, and it requires power and energy. Yeah, I've heard estimates of Bitcoins requiring as much energy as it takes to power a house in the West for as an elaborate amount of time. What is the scalability of that, right? So I just want to raise these issues both for ourselves as people who are on this planet, but also for non-human stakeholders as well who are on the planet, for whom we're making decisions about tool use and infrastructure that affects not only ourselves, but others. And this just represents some of those others. So I want to remind you, as I leave you with these very hard problems, that our goal is progress, not perfection. I think it's very important to be gentle with ourselves. Don't look for right. Fixing it entirely is not a possibility. These are very, very challenging problems. But we can hold ourselves accountable to progress. And we can move in those directions. And it's really important that we, as the people who are the builders and designers of these technologies, are the ones who bring these questions to the public to ensure that the society as a whole participates in these value propositions and conversations. And so with that, I'll just say that I haven't been doing this work alone, but I've been really wonderful colleagues that have worked with over the last couple of decades, and wonderful PhD students who have all participated in this work. And with that, I will thank you. And it's 5 o'clock.